I'd like to welcome you to our event this evening, which is an occasion on which we can enjoy the company of Mike J, who's a historian of ideas, culture, medicine, and madness. He's going to tell us about his new book, published by Yale University Press, and it's called Free Radicals. It's about all sorts of things, really. It's a very complicated, interwoven history of a number of people who had radical politics, interests in science and medicine, and it's also a history of a particular institution, which is the Pneumatic Institute of Bristol. Some of you may have heard of this. Bristol, as we all know, a very long way from here, but some of you may know a bit about Bristol, and Bristolians, they all appear to know about the Pneumatic Institute. But we're going to cover all of those things. Mike is an author who specializes in psychedelics and the history of drugs, and he's published many books on this subject, and he writes regularly for the London Review of Books, New York Review of Books, and he has a website that you can read about his work, and I'd recommend you do that because it's really interesting stuff. And you can find that website by Googling Mike J. So, Mike, how did you come to write this book?
Hi, Stuart, thank you. Am I audible? Yeah, good all the way to the back. That's a good question. I mean, as Stuart says, I've written quite a lot about the history of drugs, which sounds as if it's a specialism, but actually it's more of a generalism. I find that the reason I've written such a lot about it is, well, firstly, when I started writing about it, nobody was writing about it. It's just, there was just kind of one sort of flavor of, drugs in the media, which was the drug problem and crime and addiction and so on, and nobody much was writing about what drugs actually were or what they did or where they came from. So that kind of became my beat, and the reason I stuck with it partly, I think, is because it takes you in so many different directions. You find yourself writing about literature, and then you're writing about neuroscience, and then anthropology, and sort of psychology and history and so on. So it's really a sort of license to cherry pick all this interesting stuff from lots of different disciplines. And I got interested in the history of it, just trying to work out, where these things that we currently call drugs had come from, because like most people, I grew up with this assumption that they'd been invented in the 60s by hippies, and of course it turns out when you dig around that they've all got very different histories and have emerged from different parts of the world or from laboratories, and they key us into really interesting histories of science and discovery. And as I followed this, a lot of threads led back to this story of the Pneumatic Institution, which was where the chemist Humphrey Davy, who's one of the big names in this story, first synthesized and inhaled nitrous oxide, which was the first time that anyone had synthesized a new psychoactive, mind-altering substance in a laboratory. And since then, of course, that's become part of our modern story, from all the way through the 19th century, from morphine and cocaine through to LSD or ecstasy or whatever. So this is really the beginning of that story. And then, of course, the people who inhaled it were experiencing a state of consciousness that no human being had ever experienced before, which was fascinating in its in its own right, and they set up a new type of scientific inquiry that hadn't existed before. They constituted a group of volunteers, all of whom inhaled nitrous oxide and wrote their descriptions of what the experience was like from all kinds of different perspectives, so doctors and surgeons and physiologists, but also people more interested in psychology and philosophy and poetry. So it's an extraordinary sort of freewheeling, wide-ranging inquiry. You know, at the beginning, as I suggest in the subtitle of the book, of what we would now call psychedelic science, but in many ways, you know, much more ambitious and in advance of the way that psychedelic science is constituted today.
Yeah, I've got a few slides to keep you all awake as we go along. And so this is the book, and you can see from all these swirly bits and colouring that here are some people who are having psychedelic experiences. And but we're just very keen that you should know about this book so you will go out and buy it later on. We were hoping to have a book signing, but it looks as though our plans for this have gone astray and the bookseller hasn't turned up. But if you all know what the book is, you can make sure that you buy it later on. And actually, you're going to love it. So, Mike, would you like to set the scene for us? Where and when does this story begin?
It's an amazing story, full of extraordinary characters, but it also unfolds at a very particular and extraordinary historical moment, I think. So it starts in 1790. So towards the end of a century where of all kinds of revolutions in science, you know, from Newton through to Lavoisier, people sort of beginning to realize for the first time what the fundamental building blocks of matter were and how they combined and how, you know, the world was put together. And also kind of social revolutions and political revolutions, the American Revolution, and just before this, the French Revolution. So people starting to get the idea that, you know, the sort of current dispensations, you know, the monarchy and, you know, all these political structures were all up for grabs. So I think one thing that, you know, united pretty much everybody in 1790 was that, you know, the absolute certainty that within a decade the world would be a completely different place from what it was. People didn't agree about how it was going to change or how it ought to change or whether this was a good thing or a bad thing. But it was a moment of enormous possibility when it seemed that things that had never been imagined, you know, were suddenly coming to pass.
Yeah, it's very dangerous to say this, but it appears to me that this is primarily the story of two people, both of whom are chemists. That's Thomas Beddoes and his assistant Humphrey Davy. So let's start with Beddoes. Who is Thomas Beddoes?
Well, Thomas Beddoes was he was from Shropshire, and he was the son of a tanner, and he was obviously from an early age an extraordinary, prodigious intelligence. So if we're starting the story in 1790, as I do, at that point he's lecturing at Oxford University on chemistry and geology. These are subjects that haven't been taught at Oxford or Cambridge up until this point, and he knows more about them than pretty much everybody else in the country. But that's not all he knows. He also, you know, reads and translates Greek and Latin and German, very unusual at that point, and French and Italian and Spanish. So he's read pretty much everything, you know, about physiology and chemistry and geology and all these languages. And, you know, in German, he's kind of reading the things that people know nothing about, like, you know, the history of Christianity, or sort of, he's probably the first person in English to write about Immanuel Kant, for example. He's sort of grappling with all this stuff. But at the center of this huge constellation of his interests is medicine. And he's always been passionate about medicine. What's the point of learning, you know, he says, and, you know, unless it is to help the greatest number of people, you know, and what's the discipline, you know, that does the greatest good for the greatest number of people? And as far as he's concerned, that's medicine. So that's his passion, and it's not what he's teaching at the moment, but he's very engaged. He's one of the first doctors to really kind of become aware of the sort of industrial diseases, miner's lung, all these things that are starting to spread in Birmingham and in the new industrial areas and in the Cornish mines. He's particularly preoccupied with consumption, which is the disease. As he goes around the country, he's always paying attention to public health. And he realizes that consumption and these lung diseases are, you know, it's sort of extremely prevalent, and, you know, that's really what you need to focus on. So
that's tuberculosis, right?
Yes, that's yeah, which what we would now call tuberculosis. Yeah, and in 1790, when he has the idea that actually the best way to focus everything that he knows about, we're doing something that nobody's ever done before, which is to do sort of experiments and research into the use of gases in medicine. So he's a generation younger than people like Joseph Priestley, you know, who was the first person to experiment with a lot of these gases, and who's discovered, for example, that if you isolate oxygen, you know, and you put a mouse in a bell jar of oxygen, it lives longer than one just in air. So there's obviously some great life-giving principle in oxygen. So, and more gases are being discovered at this point. And so his idea is, why don't we synthesize all these new gases that we're only just beginning to discover that exist, and see if they can work as medicines? Because at this point, medicines are always something that are either swallowed or applied to the skin. But for all these lung diseases, why don't we apply, you know, medicines directly, you know, to the seat of the infection, to the lung, by making them breathable?
So at this point, Beddoes is lecturing at Oxford, and he is a fellow of Pembroke College. He's teaching medicine. Is that right?
Chemistry and geology he's teaching.
Yes, but at that time, presumably you couldn't actually study for a degree in chemistry or geology.
No, this was very frustrating to him, because he was getting enormous crowds, but his lectures there were really sort of optional extras. I'll have that one. Sorry about that. Thanks. We might, yes. Yes, that nobody was being tested on them, so he was...
Carry on.
Well, so he was lecturing to, you know, crowded lecture halls, but none of the people he was lecturing to were going to take chemistry up as a profession. He only had a very small laboratory there to work with, so if he wanted to do chemical work himself, he was working in other places, in the laboratories of his friends, and he was very well connected up in Shropshire with a lot of the industrialists out there, sort of members of the famous Lunar Society, so people like Matthew Bolton and James Watt, who were starting large factories there. There was Stuart Reynolds, no relation, who was the iron master up at Iron Bridge and Colebrookdale, and this was really where chemistry was happening in Britain. Was you know, in these in these factories and industrial areas where people were kind of, you know, using chemistry for for industry. So that was really, you know, where his sympathies were and, you know, where he was developing his expertise. So at this point he was kind of torn between, on the one hand, you know, the prestige of being an Oxford lecturer, but then on the other hand, you know, the real world that was really going to push his science and his discoveries forward was somewhere else.
So at this time he was not actually practicing medicine with patients.
He had a medical degree, and he did have patients, but he also, I mean, everywhere he went, if you read his letters, he was a wonderful letter writer, and he writes letters all the time, and wherever he is, he gives a health report. You know, he says, oh, there's terrible pestilence here, everybody's got influenza, it's, down in Cornwall, everybody's ill, and you know why it is? It's because, you know, the windows in their houses are too small, so they're suffocating themselves with their hearth smoke, and, you know, so he's constantly, whether or not he's actually, you know, engaged in medical practice, that's kind of where his mind is all the time.
So we're starting to talk about this man as both extraordinarily focused on his chemical medicine, but also as being a great polymath. And I just thought it's quite nice to point out some of these people up here who were influences. The one in the middle, Joseph Black. Now, he was a pretty strong influencer. How was that?
Yeah, he taught Beddoes chemistry up in Edinburgh, and he isolated what we now call carbon dioxide, which he called fixed air. There was this kind of, one of the problems with chemistry was this sort of nomenclature. Everybody used different words for everything, and people in Britain were only just starting to read Lavoisier, who Beddoes had read, and Lavoisier had shown that actually, you know, all this essence of this and flower of that, and, you know, that actually there were basic elements, and everything was a combination of these elements, and Beddoes was one of the few people who'd got the message. So he was a spokesman for this kind of new chemistry, if you like. But the conjunction of chemistry and medicine that he was proposing was also very novel. There wasn't really very much in the way of chemical drugs. I mean, there were things like opium and, you know, sort of former, you know, sort of folk remedies like digitalis. But by and large, you know, physicians didn't use a lot in the way of medicines, and they thought it was rather kind of, you know, that was the sort of thing that quacks did, you know, kind of prescribing people large toxic doses of mercury or antimony or whatever, and that was the kind of thing that they would hand off to apothecaries, or that poor people who couldn't afford a doctor would use. So Beddoes was, I think, quite unique at the time in being focused on, you know, having this absolute conviction that medicine was going to be transformed sooner or later by chemistry, you know, and by the development of chemistry and the development of new chemical medicines.
And the other really interesting thing about Beddoes is that actually he was politically, well, perhaps not an extremist, but he's very committed to radical politics. But, I mean, how did that come about, do you think? Is it something in his background, or is it just his character?
I think it was the world that he moved in. I mean, a lot of these people, you can see William Reynolds here in his Quaker hat. You know, these people who were Beddoes' mentors were, a lot of them were nonconformists, they were Unitarians, or they were Quakers. So they were prohibited by the Test Acts from being, you know, working for the government or getting civil service jobs or anything. They were kind of excluded from society, and, you know, they were a state within a state in many ways, and particularly in the areas where they were, you know, they had wealthy benefactors. They had their own schools and their own hospitals, you know, so he was always in this world which was very different from the monarchist, royalist world. And people in that world were welcomed the French Revolution when it happened. This looked as if it was an outbreak of common sense, you know, that all this kind of concentration of power and, you know, ridiculous sort of pomp and circumstance of monarchy, that we didn't need that. We could actually, you know, have sensible, cheap, efficient government without it. A lot of progressive causes, were quite common in his milieu. Anti-slavery, for example, and he was very opposed to the sort of the British colonial activity in India. He felt that this was not only oppressing Indians, but actually very bad for the health of us as a nation to get used to all these imported luxuries. That it was all sort of corrupting us. And he was not in a minority in welcoming the French Revolution, and he had a revolutionary cockade. That's the other on the cover of the book. Those are the sort of colours. That's what's kind of swirling around, and. And people kind of addressed each other as citizen in the street, and there was kind of general, sort of rejoicing that France was finally catching up with Britain, because people thought, well, this is going to be like our glorious revolution, like 1788, 100 years later, they're finally going to have a constitutional monarchy. But then, as the French Revolution descended into violence and chaos, Beddoes was, partly because of this world that he was in, he still stuck to his guns. He still believed it. He still believed it was right, and in ways that he was quite naive about, I think. The general public opinion in Britain swung very sharply to the right, became more authoritarian, and it became a terrible slur to be a suspected Jacobin, as it might be today, to be a communist or fellow traveller, and so that's where Beddoes found himself.
Do you think that that's why he left Oxford?
Yes. I mean, I think certainly what people said after he left was, he had to leave because of his revolutionary sympathies. But actually the reason he left was because he had decided that, he was going to throw his lot in, with his sponsors in the Lunar Society and the industrialists in the Midlands and the Shropshire where he was from, and that he wasn't, going to try and seek his career among the royalists and monarchists in Oxford and London.
There's another set of people here who influenced Beddoes' career. On the left there, as you're looking at it, there's Erasmus Darwin, who in lots of ways is a rather similar figure to Beddoes.
He is. I think he was Beddoes' most direct mentor, because Erasmus Darwin, Charles's grandfather, was probably the most respected physician in Britain. George III had tried to get him as his personal physician more than once, and not done so, but he was also a prolific scientist and inventor. He lived the life that Beddoes ended up living, taking bumpy carriage rides up and down the country, ministering to wealthy patients, and all the time that Erasmus Darwin was doing that, he had notebooks and sketch pads on the go, and was making all these amazing inventions. Things that look, internal combustion engines and things, sort of sketches for this. They're almost like kind of a later version of Leonardo's sketchbooks. And on top of that, he was also, the most celebrated best-selling poet in the country. He wrote these huge, very hard to read now, kind of long verse epics about botany and natural history, which were sort of, I guess, the David Attenborough documentaries of their day. They served up the natural world in kind of, vivid technicolor and, some beautiful flowing verse couplets.
So, in lots of ways, as Beddoes is struggling with the politics of the time and thinking about the scientific opportunities, and also thinking about how he's going to make a name for himself and a good living for himself as a doctor, he's really saying, well, what I want to do is to be Erasmus Darwin.
Yes, and but I think he wants to do more than Darwin. He wants to, as it were, take the ideas that are in Darwin's sketchpads and actually turn them into projects. And this is something, that the Pneumatic Institution, as it turned out to be, was something that had never been done before. I mean, today we would call it a medical research institution, and you know, we're used to these things. But at that time, experiment wasn't something that really had a place in medicine. It was kind of rather unethical. I mean, who would you experiment on? Would you experiment on patients? You know, you're supposed to be treating patients. You know, they're not your playthings. So the idea of experimental medicine was rather kind of, you know, it was, you know, doing medicine by trial and error, you know, but Beddoes insisted that no, we have to do this, you know, we're not going to find any new treatments, and, you know, I'm sure there are new treatments out there and whole new approaches to medicine we haven't thought about, and we need to set up a special institution where we can research these and do experiments and establish, you know, how medicine's going to progress.
Yeah, that comes out of your treatment of this in your book beautifully, actually. And actually, the picture that you're painting for us here of Thomas Beddoes is of a man who's extraordinarily ambitious.
Yeah, I don't think he's ambitious for himself. You know, we'll see the contrast when we come to Humphrey Davy, you know, but Beddoes is extremely generous with the people he's working with. He's always pushing people forward, and he's always very keen to be seen as, you know, part of a movement, very sort of collegiate. So he's writing these, you know, medical books and pamphlets, and he always includes bits of work by other people and case reports and anecdotes, and, you know, so he's not somebody who is kind of ambitious for himself, but he's extremely ambitious for science and for medicine and for the vision of the world that he thinks is coming.
Yes. Okay. So at this point in his career, he decides, or maybe somebody tells him, I'm not really quite clear about this, that what he wants to do is to set up a research institute. Do you think that was his idea, or did it come from a whole bunch of other people? And I did put up on this slide here a whole lot of other people who might have been the one to suggest it. I mean, James Watt, we've all heard of him. He certainly knew about experiments. Edgeworth, an inventor. And then you've got the Duchess of Devonshire.
Yeah.
And she's an even more amazing person in lots of ways. I mean, she's a scientist, and she's also moving in very high circles in society, knows about money.
That's right, yes. No, I mean, I think a lot of these people would not have encouraged Thomas Beddoes to go forward. You know, they'd have, you know, and it was obvious from the beginning that this was going to be a difficult thing to get going. He could talk about it all night with people like Erasmus, Darwin, and James Watt, who he knew well, and they were very helpful. James Watt ended up designing all the equipment for it and made huge contributions to it. But it was obvious from the beginning that this was going to be a hard thing to explain to the traditional funders of science, to people like the Royal Society, and the kind of aristocratic patronage, you know, which is the way in which sort of science went forward. This is not Beddoes' world, you know, so he didn't have a lot of support in that world. I mean, Georgiana, the Duchess of Devonshire, was an exception. You know, she was, you know, she came forward to help with funding and sponsorship, and she also argued his case, you know, at the Royal Society with Joseph Banks, who she knew very well and who respected her as a scientist. But you know, but it became clear quite early on that if this was going to get going, it was going to be from Beddoes' constituency of, you know, progressive, non-conformist, industrialist. You know, the new money was where the support was going to come from.
Well, that's very interesting. So, at last, we arrive at the Pneumatic Institute in Bristol. There's a little map up there that tells you it was in Hotwells. Now, do you want to tell us about what it was, where it was?
Yes,
that kind of stuff?
It's still there. I was there yesterday afternoon, actually, and it's building on the corner of Dowry Square now has a new owner, and he's very interested in this story, and he opened it all up for the open weekends thing a couple of weeks ago, and I think he's doing more salons there, so I'm delighted that the building is back on the map, as it were. It's down in Hotwells, kind of just where there's that huge loop of the A4 now and the flyover. It's kind of hard to imagine what it was like before then, but it must have been absolutely stunning, particularly before the road went in, because a lot of the Avon Gorge there was dynamited to open it up, and it was a spectacularly beautiful gorge, and it spilled down into Hotwells there, and Beddoes was looking around for a place, he originally thought, well, this would have to be in London, because that's all the action is, and then it took him a while to realise that actually he had very few supporters in London, and that wasn't going to work, and then somebody suggested Bristol, because he needed a particular combination of things, really. He was going to fund this, apart from donation, by his medical practice, so he needed a rich clientele of patients who he could work for, and Bristol had that. But he also, the experimental work he was doing and trying to treat consumption and so on, for him, it was much more urgent to treat the poor than the rich, because they were the reservoir of infectious diseases, and that was where medicine should be concentrated, and physicians at this point, mostly just treated the wealthy, and if you weren't wealthy, then you couldn't afford a doctor, and you'd make do with a quack or an apothecary or a sort of herbal remedy or whatever. So he wanted a city that had this kind of rich and poor, and Bristol had both of those, and it also had Hotwells, which had been set up really in an attempt to sort of piggyback on the success of Bath, because the Hotwells, as the name suggests, there's warm springs there that gush out into the Avon, and since the 17th century there had been a kind of, sort of walled-in baths, and there were lots of sort of quack doctors around, saying that the water had wonderful properties, and lots of people went down there for cures. Maybe the people who couldn't afford to come to Bath for a cure would go down to Hotwells. So there were all these patients down there in Hotwells. So that's where he was looking. And in the 18th century, a few nice Georgian terraces and squares have popped up, just on the hills, like catching a bit of a breeze, above the Avon, and so that's the location that he settled on for the Pneumatic Institution.
Yes, and as you say, that area there in Hotwells, unlike what happens here in Bath, is actually very close to where there were lots of people working in ordinary manual heavy work.
That's right,
the docks.
At the docks down there. And there was also a pontoon, so you could, if you were in Bath and you wanted an outing for the day, you could get a boat down the Avon there, and when you got to Hotwells Parade, there would be, sort of ice cream sellers, and, it was kind of like a little holiday promenade, but as the 18th century wore on, it got kind of grimmer and grimmer. There were all these sort of cadaverous patients in the last stages of consumption, and it became a less and less appealing place to visit.
Mm-hmm. So you present Hotwells as actually being just there anyway, a pretty nice place to live. Do you think that the neighbours complained about the Institute at the time? Is there a record of that? Yes, there is. I mean, Beddoes started off in Hope Square, which is a couple of squares up, and the neighbours were not very keen about having all these consumptive patients drifting in, and they were also not very keen about having all these pneumatic airs, as they were called, kind of synthetic gases being synthesised in their backyards. That was where Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, went to visit him in Hope Square, and she said, I think you need bigger premises, because why don't you really need a hospital, enough room for a few beds, so that you can have, not just a clinic where people turn up and collect their remedies, but you can, you can give these new experimental treatments to people in-house, you can have residential patients, and so that was why he moved to Dowry Square, to a setup where he had
Yeah, on the ground floor, a clinic for patients, and then kind of a nice drawing room upstairs, and in the attic, a room for the, the member of the team that he hadn't yet located, who would be the laboratory superintendent, who would live on the premises.
Well, indeed, that's our next port of call, because pretty soon Beddoes found that he did need help, and here's the chap that he hired. Now, can you tell us who was Humphrey Davy? Where does he come from? How did Beddoes get to know him? And those kinds of questions.
Well, one of Beddoes' students at Oxford, who he became very friendly with, was a Cornishman called Davis Giddy. And in fact, in the summer of 1790, when all this starts, Beddoes spent that summer in Cornwall with Giddy, and they researching geology. Beddoes was convinced that in a world where pretty much everybody assumed that the world was only 6,000 years old and had been created by God. Beddoes had seen enough chemistry, and he'd spent enough time up at Colebrook Dale watching iron ore being heated and seeing what happened to ore, when it was melted and how it recrystallized. So he was pretty sure that all the granites and basalts and everything in Cornwall were igneous, and that the earth was constantly sort of spewing this out, and we were looking at a process that had been going on for millions of years. So, that's, it must have been odd to be absolutely sure of that in a world where nobody else believed it. So he spent time in Cornwall with Davis Giddy, and then when he went back to Bristol, Giddy stayed in Cornwall, and they stayed in touch. And at this point in the story, he told Giddy that he was looking for a superintendent, a young chemist for the laboratory to synthesize all the gases. And Giddy had just at this point met this extraordinary young man, still a teenager, Humphrey Davy, who lived in Penzance, just near to Giddy, and who was an absolute, complete self-taught prodigy in chemistry. And he had done amazing things. There was one Frenchman in town, a nobleman kind of fleeing the French Revolution, and Davy, as a young teenager, got this man to teach him French. He then got hold of Lavoisier's treatise on chemistry and read it himself and taught it himself, and then just scavenging around an old shipwreck on the coast, found an old, it was an enema syringe actually, which he could use to pump out a vacuum, and he demonstrated just with this and a block of ice and a little clockwork motor that, the motion of the motor, even in a vacuum, generated enough heat to melt the ice. He was just, he was extraordinary. And then as soon as Davis Giddy met him, he said, well, you must come back, to my house, because I've got a laboratory and I've got a library, and of course, loads of books by Beddoes. So that was Humphrey Davy's introduction. And if it hadn't been for that, Davy at the time was apprenticed to a pharmacist in Penzance. And if it hadn't been for this connection through Giddy to Beddoes, then Davy would presumably have spent the rest of his life being, running a pharmacy in Penzance. That would have been all that was on offer to him.
Well, who knows? That's certainly something to think about. I think that we need to stress the extreme youth at the time of Davy. He's at this time, he's what, 18, 19?
Yeah, he's like just 20 when he arrives at the Pneumatic Institute.
Yeah. And from a very humble background too. This, his father was a manual worker, a mason. Yep. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And kind of often unemployed, and his mother kept kept everything together. Yeah, but from a very sort of real fairly impoverished and extremely provincial and remote background.
Yeah. So an extraordinary person. So Beddoes and Davy set up their Pneumatic Institute, and the mission statement, as we would say nowadays, of the Pneumatic Institute was basically to look for the possibilities of cures of chronic diseases in various kinds of atmospheric gases. Yeah. And somehow they stumble rather early on onto nitrous oxide, which had previously been discovered by Priestley, but nobody really seemed to know very much about it.
No, Priestley had synthesized it, and he called it dephlogisticated nitrous air. That was the way that pre-Lavoisier, that was the way that Priestley's nomenclature worked. And it said that one American chemist called Samuel Latham Mitchell had studied it and said that this appears to be kind of toxic, and maybe the element of decay, just in the way that oxygen is kind of seems to have the spirit of life in it. Nitrous oxide has the spirit of death. Things that put in it die, and it's kind of toxic. And Humphrey Davy, synthesized it. It was one of the first things he synthesized at the Pneumatic Institution, and he inhaled a little bit of it just to see how toxic it was, and didn't appear to be toxic at all. So he inhaled a little bit more, and it had quite a nice sweet taste. And he inhaled a bit more and started to feel this tingling and pins and needles, and there was sort of a bit of a thrilling in his chest and extremities, he describes it as, and then a sort of pleasure, a kind of euphoria stealing over him. So he carried on inhaling more and more, and felt this, great surge, this sort of rush, very ecstatic and very pleasurable. And then, as it went on, it turned into this moment of sort of epiphany and revelation. He sort of felt as if he was suddenly kind of seeing reality for the first time. And then, as he stopped inhaling it and it wore off, then, this vision that he'd had kind of dwindled away, and he couldn't quite focus on it. But, he came back, and his first thought was, well, let's do that again. So, so after all these years of trying to get the Pneumatic Institution going, and all this commitment to the idea of, gases and chemical medical therapy, the very first discovery they made was something completely unexpected, and something that produced, generated all these extraordinary questions. How could it possibly be that, this is a gas that we've just made in the laboratory? As far as we know, it doesn't exist in nature. How can it be that if you inhale a lungful of it, you have, these feelings of sort of really profound happiness, and then this amazing stimulation of the imagination? What's going on there? What does that tell us about the connection between the mind and the body? Is there a pleasure center in the brain? How is it doing this? So it immediately set them off on this completely new set of questions. But that was, as Beddoes had said, if it's real experiment, not like the old-fashioned Galenic type of experiment, like the experiments that we did in chemistry classes, where you knew what the result was going to be. If it was genuine experiment where you didn't know what the outcome was going to be, you couldn't predict it, then, you just have to follow it where it goes.
Indeed. This idea of self-experimentation is very interesting, really. Somewhat frowned upon today, I think, but there's a long tradition of self-experimentation in medicine. Do you think that Beddoes, and particularly Davy, actually started this idea of self-experimentation?
No, it was there from the beginning. I mean, if you remember back to the Royal Society, nullius in verba, take nobody's word for it. Everything has to be demonstrated by experiment, and experiments have to be witnessed and they have to be repeated. So experiment was what science was all about, and it was even back in the days of Boyle and Newton and Hooke, people understood that there were certain experiments that you couldn't just do demonstrate objectively, because they were about perceptions and sensations. So Isaac Newton, for example, when he was doing his work on light and prisms, he noticed that if you stick your finger in your eye, and jab it in, you get these strange rainbows and refractions. And so Newton described, in great detail how he did. He took a bodkin, like a large knitting needle, and shoved it right up behind his eyeball, and described what he'd seen and showed how he'd do it if anybody else could do it. So, from the very beginning, science, you had to experiment on yourself if there was no other way of doing it. It was also kind of ethical. There was an idea that you shouldn't experiment on patients, and so you shouldn't really experiment on somebody else if you weren't prepared to experiment on yourself. So it was a good upstanding thing to do, and I think particularly for Davy, there was also a bit of a romance to it. You were really going the extra mile. You were really showing that you were committed to science by, making yourself part of the experiment.
Yeah, maybe the fact that he was 20 had something to do with it.
Yeah, and he was a very fearless experimenter.
He really went for it, didn't he?
He did, and he was a very reckless experimenter generally. He was an absolutely brilliant experimenter in terms of knowing, okay, if I want to prove this, then what are the experiments I have to do to conclusively prove it? Boom, 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 boom. And he was publishing, there was a chemical journal called Nicholson's Journal, which was the kind of clearinghouse. And so if you want to establish your priority in something, then, that was where you published. And Davy was always writing letters going, okay, I've done this, and claiming his territory. But so on that level, he was brilliant, but he was extremely careless as well. He was always cutting himself and breaking things. He writes things like, as I accidentally happened to cut my finger down to the bone while I was doing something else, I thought, well, I'll dip this in nitric oxide and see what happens. So he was Joseph Cottle, who was Coleridge's publisher, who was in London, who was around for all of the experiments. So Davy acted like a cat with 9 lives, as if he always had a few to spare.
Yeah, and they do it again and again, eventually to the detriment of Davy's health. And he has to give up for a bit, doesn't he? Because actually he's suffering.
Yes, that's most. He's trying everything, So he's trying, nitric oxide, for example, which is presumably what people like Mitchell thought. Well, they were talking about when they were talking about nitrous oxide, because nitric acid is quite toxic. It's a brownish gas, and if you inhale it, it just turns into nitric acid on your teeth and gums and stuff. So he'd do that a bit, and he'd also inhale, carbon monoxide and things that we know are really quite dangerous.
Yes.
And and he describes experiments where he was like, "Oh, I'm very lucky that the airbag I was inhaling from fell from my lips when I passed out. Otherwise, I might have died." But nitrous oxide, he's fascinated by the effects of kind of taking more and more of it, and he does this. He says, partly for experiment. He's doing an awful lot of work, like he's establishing, for example, how much of the gas gets absorbed into the bloodstream, what happens to your pulse and your breathing, under the influence of it. There's a lot of physiological work to do. So he's doing that, but he's also, when there's a full moon and it's a nice summer night, he's filling up. James Watt designed this equipment for Beddoes, and it's you heat gases and you collect them in a little tin plate holder, and then James Watt had also designed this green silk bag so that you could tap off the gas and take it. So if you were administering it to a patient, you didn't have to do the chemical reaction, right by the patient's bedside. You could the gas was portable. So yeah, when you got a full moon, then Davy would think, I'll just fill some of these bags with gas and I'll go wandering out up into the Avon Gorge, and he'd perch himself there with his notebook and kind of write poetry and amazing scientific discoveries while kind of inhaling it under the moon. So it was kind of, and then he finished the conclusion of his experiments. He wanted to see what happened if you took just as much of it as you possibly could. And James Watt had built a thing like a sort of telephone box that you could sit in, which was actually built for patients who were too weak to hold an airbag to their lips, that you could just sit in it and be filled with gas. So Davy sat in it and got someone to fill it with gas for an hour, and then stepped out and then inhaled another huge bag of it, and then at that point he said, you know, he'd kind of completely lost any sense of his body, became completely, had a complete out-of-body experience and entered a whole new dimension, as he said, where nothing exists but thoughts and the world was composed entirely of ideas.
Indeed, we can see him doing it there.
Yeah.
One of the patients, I didn't track down who it was, said, "I feel like the sound of a harp." Astonishingly poetic account of what's going on. And indeed, we've mentioned this word poet and poetry quite a bit. And so another fascinating bit of this story is Davy becomes actually very friendly with Coleridge and Southey. And my little note of this says it is radical chic and nitrous oxide.
Yeah.
I mean, these guys are not only poets, they're also pretty extreme revolutionists as well. And so, you know, what's going on here? Is Davy associating with them because he's like that in the first place, or does he pick up some of his radical politics from them?
I mean, this is another reason why self-experiment becomes important, because if all you're doing is measuring, you know, pulse and sort of blood pressure and so on, you can do that on a rabbit or a guinea pig. But, you know, if you're dealing with something that alters your consciousness, there's no point in giving it to rabbits and guinea pigs and asking them to explain what goes on. So, you know, the effects on consciousness have to be assessed by humans. So Davy gets fascinated by this and by the fact that the experience is so intense and so extraordinary, but so hard to put into words. So, as he says early on, you know, we need a language of feeling. This is a new experience that nobody's, you know, experienced before, and we don't really have the words for it. So how do we find these words? And, you know, this was something that Coleridge and Southey were also interested in, a language of feeling. Their idea of poetry was a new type of poetry that could talk about moods and emotions and sensations and describe them in a way that nobody had before. The connection between them, you know, goes back to Cornwall, where one of the things that Thomas Beddoes would do with Davis Giddy would be sort of send young consumptive patients down for the winter, because the climate in Cornwall in the winter was sort of felt to be better. So he sent James Watt's son down, for example, and that was where, and also Josiah Wedgwood's son, Tom Wedgwood, who's a very important figure in this story, an extraordinary experimental genius, but also very, very sickly and poor, you know, very, very poor health, and died young. But he spent a lot of time down there, and he and Davy became very, very firm friends and shared a lot of interests, you know, across science and poetry. And actually, Tom Wedgwood was a brilliant experimenter, and I think Davy learned a lot of his experimental technique from him. And then when they came up to Bristol, Tom Wedgwood became very, very close friends with Coleridge and Southey, and he ended up being the person, you know, who sponsored Coleridge, paid him an annuity and kept him going, and, you know, believed that Coleridge and Southey, you know, they were the voices of the next generation. They were the people who were going to lead us, you know, sort of into the next century and into the, you know, next phase of civilization. And he was quite evangelical about them. So they all became very good friends. Davy, as he showed previously, also wrote poetry. In fact, he was kind of, you know, a lot of people who remembered him as a teenager in Cornwall didn't remember the chemistry bit, but they remembered him being obsessed by poetry. So, you know, they all formed this, you know, this circle where poetry and science and chemistry in particular all kind of crossed over into one another.
To the point where Coleridge actually asks Davy to be the proofreader for the lyrical ballads, and he doesn't actually do a very good job.
Yes.
Perhaps displaying the same kind of carelessness that he did in some other departments. So Davy is getting on tremendously here. There's a really terrific picture here, this one. It really attracted attention. The poets were going for the gases, and this is a cartoon showing a poet composing verse under the influence of a gas, and the cartoonist supposes that it's actually not laughing gas, it's something else.
But you can see how this idea caught on. So poor old Beddoes, who'd been, sort of banging the drum for this new idea of kind of chemical medicine and therapeutic gases. But once the accounts started to leak out of the Pneumatic Institute, everybody was just fascinated by the idea that these, these boffins and these poets were getting together and had discovered this intoxicating gas and were having these kind of strange revels. That became, the image of the Pneumatic Institution.
Yes, and then it all falls apart very quickly. So the Pneumatic Institution, after only a couple of years, loses Davy. So he's tempted to go away to work at the Royal Institution in London. So why did Davy leave, do you think?
I think Davy didn't have the kind of same radical political background as the rest of them. He was much younger. He was very, he'd never really been exposed to politics. He was, he'd only been sort of a young child when the French Revolution happened. And I think, he could see that the way that the Pneumatic Institution was being perceived, that despite all its amazing chemical discoveries and all its promises of a new era in medicine, this was the image that was going forward. And Davy was more ambitious than that. And he'd already at this point moved on in 1800, an amazing year for him. He published his account of the nitrous oxide researches, and Beddoes had previously published various pamphlets and made all kinds of wild claims which had been satirized like this. When Davy wrote his report, it was much more serious. It was 600 pages. It was absolutely cutting-edge chemistry, and it was the whole story, at least 100 pages, talking about oxygen and nitrogen and the different possible combinations of them and how they worked, and then whole big sections on the physiology of the gases and respiration, and concluding with all the descriptions of the experience that he'd got from, Coleridge and Southey and all the other volunteers. So it's an amazing book. He called it Researches Chemical and Philosophical, which is what it is. It tells the whole story from the chemistry, right through to this kind of, this amazing sort of expanded consciousness and, the experience that the gas produces. So after he'd published this, he was pretty much the most sought after young chemist in London and getting all kinds of offers. And at the same time, Alessandro Volta in Italy published his first papers on showing that if you had, combined layers of different metals and saline solutions, you could get something that kept a steady current. Until then, electricity had been mostly kind of static electricity that was discharged by things like Leyden jars. Once you could keep a steady current, there are all kinds of things you could do. And Beddoes was extremely helpful to Davy in this because he could read all the Italian, of course, and translate it. And, they built these sort of more and more complex and powerful voltaic piles. And Davy started to realize that, at the two poles of this, if you put, water kind of splits into hydrogen and oxygen, and then all these other things that people had thought were elements like soda and potash actually turned out to be, oxides and combinations. And so Davy was obviously, a competitive field, but he was right at the front, and this was obviously going to transform chemistry. And at that point, he got an offer from Count Rumford, who ran the Royal Institution in London, to be based there with his amazing laboratory and lecturing to all the great and good in London. And Davy, who, unlike Beddoes, was very personally ambitious, he was off like a shot. As I think partly he wanted to put, the taint of radical politics behind him, but also he wanted to he wrote to his mother saying, I'm going up in the world, you'll be glad to see me getting among the royalists, and his first demonstrations at the Royal Institution, were a spectacular success. First traffic jam in London, apparently, all the carriages queued up and all that. So Davy was off, and he never really looked back.
Yeah, and here they are doing it in the Royal Institution. Davy only did this once, is that right?
Yes, that's right. He did, in his introductory course of lectures, he did 2 on electricity and electrolysis. And he did this one nitrous oxide one, which was went down very, very well. But you can see the portrayal of it. I mean, this is James Gilray, and it's not really kind of saying that it's not moralistic. He's just as Gilray always did. He's just got his great eye for the absurd, and he's going, look at all these wonderful natural philosophers at play making idiots of themselves. But again, Davy decided he was slightly above this, and he went on, to greater things. And within a couple of years, he'd isolated this unprecedented series of new elements, sodium and potassium and so on. And he was off. And then he was became a member of the Royal Society almost immediately. He became Sir Humphrey Davy, first man since Newton to be knighted for his science, and then the president of the Royal Society. So off he went on his glittering career.
Indeed. But that's not the end of the story for nitrous oxide. Davy didn't do more with nitrous oxide, but as you can see in this picture here, the Victorians kept on with nitrous oxide in a rather undignified sort of way. And it wasn't only a matter of nitrous oxide parties, but also people were really very interested in what on earth this stuff was doing. This is a picture of William James, the brother of Henry James, the novelist. He's a Harvard professor, he's a physician, he's a philosopher, he's a psychologist, a writer. You could well say that William James was perhaps the top intellectual of the second half of the 19th century, and he was fascinated by this stuff. And he wrote this astonishing quote here, indicating that actually he doesn't know what the hell's going on.
That's right. I mean, this is almost 100 years later, and between the Pneumatic Institute and now, of course, this enormous thing has happened. Beddoes has posthumously been proved right. Nitrous oxide and the gases have revolutionized medicine, but through an extraordinarily circuitous route. It's by sort of the 1820s, it had acquired the name of laughing gas because it was something that was used at sort of variety shows and public performances. Somebody would turn up, with a sort of tank of nitrous oxide and give it to members of the audience to inhale, who would all kind of caper around or pass out or say, sort of bizarre things. And this became very popular in America on the carnival circuit, which was huge. And, you could play a different town every night, so you could have this as a sort of novel sensation for years and years. And it was on that carnival circuit that dentists originally started to notice that, people on nitrous oxide, didn't notice any pain. They'd see people cavorting around on the gas and whacking their shins quite hard and not appearing to feel anything. And, until it wore off. And of course, the dentists, that was extremely interesting because the limiting factor of their business was the pain. So dentists started using it, first of all, for tooth extractions, and eventually it wound round and made its way into sort of surgical anesthesia. So by a route that nobody could have been predicted, Beddoes did turn right. You know, gases did turn out to transform medicine. And then people, you know, as well as, you know, having their teeth extracted painfully, had this same strange experience in the dentist's chair. And William James, who was fascinated by consciousness and psychology, you know, people said to him, you should really try this. It's really kind of, it's like a mystical experience. It's like the things that you're always writing about. And he did. So, you know, 100 years later, at the end of the 19th century, you get, you know, these extremely distinguished philosophers and psychologists, you know, really recapitulating these ideas that had first emerged at the Pneumatic Institute.
Yes. We've sort of come to the end of the story of the Pneumatic Institute, but I just thought that for those of you who might not want to stop abruptly in the 19th century, we do actually know now how nitrous oxide works, and what you see here is a diagram of where two nerve cells join together, and an electrical impulse in one neuron can influence the activity of another neuron, and it does this by releasing neurotransmitters. And these neurotransmitters open up channels in the membrane of another nerve cell. And it turns out that one particular type of neurotransmitter receptor, it's called an NMDA receptor, is interfered with by nitrous oxide. And you can see on the right here that, on the far right here, that nitrous oxide is a modulator of this kind of transmission. And for those of you who are keen to read the news every day, like I am, you'll also be aware of another drug which has, shall we say, euphoric effects, ketamine. You'll know about this because apparently the richest man in the world is an aficionado of this drug, as reported quite recently. Actually has the same site of action.
I mean, it's fascinating that this has only just been discovered now in the 21st century. So all the way through, you know, the Pneumatic Institute, everybody dismissing these experiments, and then the discovery of anesthesia, and then it becoming standard in, you know, kind of emergency rooms and ambulances, and, you know, sort of, you know, standard part of medicine. Nobody had the faintest idea how it worked, and it turns out that for such an incredibly simple molecule, it has an extremely complex mechanism of action. You know, and this gives us some idea, I think, of, you know, why it might be so euphoric, you know. But as for the question of how it can transport you to a new dimension where nothing exists but thoughts, I think we're probably still as much in the dark as Humphrey Davy was.
Well, it may well be that that people are in the dark, but they continue to use the stuff in phenomenal quantities. I don't get out much, so I don't see this kind of thing, but you know, probably on the streets around us here, you would be able to see some of these discarded canisters. These things called whippets are actually, it's a device for whipping cream. If you blow nitrous oxide gas through the cream, it whips it. These things are really pretty easy to get hold of. And anyway, according to one report, which I came across, the authorities in Tower Hamlets in London, in the east part of London, recovered more than 1 million of these discarded whippets from the streets in a 6-month period in 2017. So it's a very, very heavily used. I was going to say it's a narcotic, but it's not a narcotic.
Dissociative, probably. Yes, they've turned out to be extremely popular, and they're popular. I mean, even though nitrous oxide has been around all the time, what you had in the sort of until recently was the same as the nitrous oxide shows in the 19th century. It was quite difficult and expensive to get a big tank of nitrous oxide, and then people realized that it was available in these tiny little canisters and that you could discharge them into a balloon and inhale them from the balloon. So this new thing is actually recapitulates, James Watt's green silk bag. It's exactly, the method of administration that the Pneumatic Institute came up with immediately.
Well, but being a responsible sort of chap, I felt that I needed to conclude this by pointing out that the law has only just caught up with nitrous oxide, and there was legislation in 2016 which extended prohibition to a number of what we might call lesser drugs of abuse, including nitrous oxide. And rather irritatingly for the government, a judge in the UK immediately ruled that since nitrous oxide was well known to be used in hospitals all the time, the legislation was not enforceable. And so just a couple of years ago, a new document was issued by the government, rather Canute-like, forbidding its use. Possession of nitrous oxide is now illegal, and before it wasn't possession that had been illegal, but selling it. It's still not entirely clear that possession of it is necessarily illegal, because you could always claim that it was therapeutic. But anyway, as is always the case with psychedelic drugs, what the government did was to justify this action by issuing an extremely long document telling you how harmful it is. And it is true that if you inhale a lot of nitric oxide over a long period, it actually interferes with the level of B vitamins, and you can then finish up with some neurological diseases, which are actually not a direct consequence of nitrous oxide inhalation, but an indirect one.
Yeah, this is what governments always do when you get a lot of, a drug in the news. The same things happened with ketamine recently. Nitrous oxide. A lot of it was actually kind of really a litter problem. The fact that these, canisters, were very visible. They're not recyclable. Nitrous oxide itself is a greenhouse gas. It's all very environmentally unfriendly. But in each case, once we hear about it, the government's response is to, make it more illegal. But then, that's really pulling a lever that isn't connected to anything. So if you look at what's happened to both nitrous oxide and ketamine, their use has been going up over the last 10, 15 years. And every time the government reclassifies them, the use just, the levels of use just carry on going up. So it's not really doing anything. I think, certainly in terms of the terms that Beddoes would understand, his goal was to sort of maximize, happiness and to minimize pain. And I think he'd recommend safe and cautious use of it. And if you use a lot of it, remember to take your B12 supplements after.
So that's it from us. We have overrun a bit, which is, of course, exactly what you'd expect when the chair is also performing. But now it's over to you. So if you've got questions, now's the time. If you will just wait until I come to you, because we do have online listeners. So I'll come to you at the back first, and then I'll come to you, Peter.
Oh, thank you. That's one of the most animated presentations I've seen over the last 5 years here. The energy you put, it was infectious. I wondered, you said they wanted to increase happiness. Did they look at the other side of things? So was it melancholy? I don't know how they classed mental illness in those days. And he must have seen places like Bedlam and problems in the poorhouse and so on.
Yes, they did. I mean, Beddoes was one of the first people to look at this. He saw it as a kind of consequence of the growth of the middle classes, you know, maybe what we might call the worried well. And he wrote a big book late in life called Hygeia, which was kind of, a lot of what he wrote was directed at the poor and at working people, and he was very unusual as a doctor, being very, very good at writing, you know, good practical guides for, you know, how to live healthily and how to, you know, avoid contagious diseases and how to treat common illnesses. But later in life, he started to realize that, you know, that wealth also created its own problems. And he saw this kind of melancholy and ennui, you know, as being part of that. And this was, you know, in a world where, you know, doctors were all private and only, you know, catering for the wealthy, they kind of colluded in this, you know. So he thought a lot of medical effort and, you know, a lot of money was being wasted on trying to treat people who were just kind of had a bit of general unhappiness with life, you know, often because, you know, they led lives of leisure. So that was, he wrote a lot about that in a very interesting way. But yeah, he kind of, more broadly, he kind of, you know, just in the same way he was really trying to create the greatest happiness for the greatest number. You know, that was the way that his mentor Erasmus Darwin thought as well. You know, that life was really, you know, neither of them had much time for kind of, you know, religion. You know, they really believed that if you know, that the main thing was about people being happy. You know, and that pleasure and pain were somehow related. And this comes out quite a lot in the nitrous oxide experiments, you know, because Davy says, you know, you feel this great wave of euphoria and at the same moment you can't feel any pain. So maybe these, you know, maybe these two are related. Maybe it's the same nerve that carries the same things. So yeah, they yoked together pleasure and pain quite a lot. But yeah, but Beddoes' remedy for melancholy was to you know, was mostly to kind of engage yourself with life and re-engage your passions and, you know, find your happiness.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your lecture. Davy did a lot of self-experimentation. Sort of contemporary of theirs, I think, was Edward Jenner in Gloucestershire. And he did a lot of self-experimentation in his process of discovering vaccination.
Yeah, that's right. And yeah, Jenner and Beddoes corresponded. They were aware of each other, I think. And Beddoes was, it has to be said, not very generous to Jenner. You know, he sort of tended to say, well, yes, of course we know about this. This is a folk remedy, this inoculation. People have been doing it for ages. And eventually, once you know, it turned out that this was making a really big difference to smallpox, then Beddoes got on board and he lobbied the Royal Society to, you know, to give Jenner an annuity, which they did in the end. But what the two of them were both doing was paying attention to preventive medicine, and which Beddoes wrote a lot about. You know, he said preventive medicine is half of medicine, and it's the half that always gets ignored because, you know, when it works, nobody notices that it's worked because the disease hasn't occurred. So yeah, they were both going around talking to, and Beddoes went around often talking to people like butchers and people of different professions who seemed to have consumption less than other people, trying, you know, so yeah, they kind of wandered around the same parts of the country and they talked to a lot of the same people and, you know. They corresponded with each other. I don't think they met. And Beddoes published a book which had a lot of contributions from medicine in the west of England, which had one of Jenner's papers in and so on. So they worked in the same world. But in the end, when we think of preventive medicine and we think of that time, it's Jenner that we think of. He was the one who got the who discovered the treatment, the therapy that worked immediately. Beddoes discovered something, but he didn't quite know what it was, and it was another generation before its value was discovered.
So looking at that very official announcement behind you, is it possible to argue a case that the world would be a better place if Humphrey Davy had been locked up for 2 years?
No, I don't think we'd have heard the end of that, I don't think. But no, I think, as your question suggests, I think it's hard to argue, isn't it?
I've added your book to a list of books I intend to read. I've got quite a lot of unread books, including one called The Lunar Men. Do you think that would act as a good prologue to your book, or is it not really necessary to understand that?
Oh yeah, no, it's a very good book. Jenny Uglow's book is an absolute classic. It's sort of. I don't think you need it to read mine, but if you read Jenny's first, then you'll be very familiar with all the characters that get introduced gradually into Beddoes' story. Yeah.
I certainly encourage you to read this book. I thought it was absolutely terrific. And one of the real features here is the enormous cast of characters. We were only able to introduce you to just a few of them. And we were talking about this before the formal part of the proceedings began. And I was just marveling about the distance between Bath and Bristol, between Jane Austen and this world. Jane Austen is often accused, I think, of ignoring a lot of what was going on at the time, although a nuanced reading, you can see some of the chaos of the times being pushed to one side. But this is an extraordinary story, isn't it? What a time to be alive. Are there some more questions here, or have we reached the time to go out to the pub? Oops.
I'd just like to ask, when was it appreciated that for medical use that it should be combined with oxygen? And by the way, for any parents here, if you want to know where your children use whippets, try Bathwick Hill, where they all go when they've finished their exams. But yeah, when did oxygen become the sort of co-administered gas?
Well, people realised quite early on, in fact, Beddoes and Davy realised that if you inhale pure nitrous oxide, then you asphyxiate. And they did tests on animals. You put an animal in a bell jar full of pure nitrous oxide, it will die. But if you put 20% of oxygen in there, it will live as long as it will in normal air. So it was quite clear from early on that if you wanted to administer nitrous oxide continually, you could do it in a mix with 20% of oxygen, and then you could just carry on breathing it as long as you needed to. And that's kind of Entonox. That's the gas and air mix that we're still familiar with, that's still used in obstetrics and childbirth and so on.
Humphrey Davy did in fact mention in his magnum opus that anesthesia was a possibility, but he never really followed that up. Why do you think that was?
I don't think surgeons were ready for it. I mean, there were surgeons among the volunteers. There's a Plymouth surgeon called Stephen Hammock who inhales nitrous oxide, and gives his account of it, and he says, in fact, they try and take the airbag away from him, and he grabs it back and says, "Give it back to me, I want some more of that." So surgeons were well aware of it, but also I think in the context in which it was used in the Pneumatic Institution, and then again, in the variety shows and so on, people tended to kind of dance around when they took it and act up. It wasn't the kind of thing that made you think, oh, you should be giving this to a patient just before surgery. And surgery at that time was, you were very in and out as quickly as possible, and it was very important to surgeons that the patient should stay conscious. If the patient lost consciousness, then they were less likely to recover. So for a long time, and all the way through the 1830s, you read surgeons and doctors going, "Oh, you'll see these quacks trying to convince us that people should be inhaling nitrous oxide before surgery." And actually, they're a terrible menace to the profession, because all that they do is they, place all this focus on the pain of surgery, and that makes people less likely to come forward to surgery. So we should ignore all these calls. So, 30 years after the Pneumatic Institution, surgeons are still saying, this is a ridiculous idea. And I think actually what really turned it was that surgeons got better, surgery got more complicated, you started having longer procedures, and the ability of the patient to endure it became a limiting factor. And it was at that point that people started to think, well, actually, maybe if we could sort of put them under safely, then that would make surgery better.
Hi. So I'm not clinical at all, but from what you're saying, it's making me think, how long is it retained in the system once you have inhaled it?
It's in and out quite quickly, because it's respired, it's kind of in with the breath. So as soon as you start breathing normal air, you start replacing it in the lungs, and it, dissolves into the bloodstream and out quite quickly. So in that sense, it's pretty short acting. I mean, that's why, for, serious surgery, you have to use, things like intravenous barbiturates and things that knock you out for much, much longer.
But it's great for dentistry. I don't know if you remember, there's a Bob Hope and Bing Crosby film from the 1940s about travelling dentistry at the turn of the 20th century, and the dentist is called Painless something or other. Yeah. Are we all done, or is there? Okay. So I'm going to ask one last question. The ambitious young Davy goes off to the Royal Institution and leaves Beddoes in possession of the Pneumatic Institute. What happened to the Pneumatic Institute without Davy there?
Well, it's the nitrous oxide experiments and the whole gas experiments and the whole experimental thing, kind of deflates. But at the same time, Beddoes is, extremely effective at, treating the poor, and more people come to him for treatment. And especially, there are, terrible sort of epidemics of infectious disease, and he's kind of right down there in the docks treating everybody. And actually, the number of patients grows and grows. When Davy was there, Beddoes and Davy didn't really keep very good case books or logs or anything, but then after Davy leaves, he's replaced by a young man called John King, amazingly talented young man, and he keeps really good logs. And you can see that, the Pneumatic Institution, it gets renamed as the Institution for the Sick and Drooping Poor, and it moves down to the docks and is treating hundreds and hundreds of people, and, really kind of reaches into that community that the Bristol Royal Infirmary, never reached, and eventually kind of they merge and it becomes part of it. So in that sense, it still continues.
Well, you know what to do now. Several bookshops here in Bath. I'm sure you know how to increase the sales figures of this splendid book. So, thanks very much for listening. and we'll see you here on another occasion.